welcome everyone. Thank you all for coming tonight. I'm Jennifer Elias. I'm an associate at Atelier 10 and also a committee member of the Sydney chapter of CTBUH. And we are thrilled to have so many of you in attendance tonight. Before we begin, I'd just like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, upon whose lands we meet tonight. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge their continuing connection to land, to sky and to country, and to acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging, as well as to pay my respects to Indigenous people in the audience tonight. Tonight's event is about celebrating, sharing knowledge, exposing and inquiring all around the competition entries for 175 Liverpool Street project. We believe that this unique series of events offers a really great opportunity for everyone involved to take a moment of just sharing the different thinking and the different approaches of each team and celebrating each of the entries. The Council on Tall Buildings and Urban Habitats is the world's leading resource for professionals focused on inception, design, construction and operation of tall buildings in future cities. CTBUH is a not-for-profit organisation founded in 1969 and based at Chicago's Illinois Institute of Technology. We facilitate the exchange of the latest knowledge available on tall buildings around the world through publications, research, events, working groups, web resources, and an extensive network of international representatives, and of course our annual conference. For further details and to become a member, please visit our website, send us an email or scan the QR code on the slide here. I want to take a second to thank our major sponsors, Oxford Properties and Schindler. They are the major sponsors of our annual series of design excellence events, and we really just couldn't do it without them. We're a not-for-profit organisation, so we really rely on our generosity of industry and generosity of our sponsors. So thank you to Oxford Properties and Schindler for funding this event this evening. I'd also like to extend our gratitude to Arab for having us in their beautiful space tonight and for funding this evening's event. We're here to celebrate 175 Liverpool Street and the teams that competed in this design competition. So I'll say just a quick briefing from the competition, which was held back a couple of years ago now. 175 Liverpool Street. It's a unique opportunity to sensitively contribute to the heritage setting of Hyde Park and to present as the backdrop of the Anzac Memorial and the southern end of Hyde Park there. It's got great potential to improve connectivity through to the vibrant Surrey Hills village, and the development will provide high quality residential, commercial and retail premises and demonstrate best practice environmentally sustainable design. The design objectives for the brief are to create a timeless architecture and contextually respectful mixed-use building which responds to and reflects the site's positioning in the southern portion of the CBD and as the backdrop to the state heritage items Anzac Memorial and Hyde Park. To contribute to creating a vibrant pedestrian experience in and around the site with exceptional ground plane interaction with the competition site and interfacing with the public domain. And to reimagine the pocket park on the site, its interface with and contribution to greening the public domain. It's also about really preserving and enhancing that public domain amenity by ensuring the future development will obviously not result in adverse overshadowing, wind and daylight impacts, to establish a really active pedestrian connection that improves permeability and connectivity to Surrey Hills, to craft a tower or towers that respond to its context on the edge of Hyde Park and interface with Surrey Hills, in form, proportion, articulation and in balance with maximising access to site and sun for occupants, to promote the use of natural materials, textures and colour scheme, to maximise opportunities for equally sustainable design and best practice environmental performance, and to achieve design excellence in accordance with the City of Sydney policy. Which brings us all here tonight. So now on to the presentations. We have a program of 5 teams who I would like to politely remind have 8 minutes per team to present on the schemes. The first competition presentation this evening will be given by Simon Parsons and Sandra Furtado. So Simon Parsons, Managing Director and Sydney Practice Leader for PTW, and Sandra Furtado, the co-founder of Furtado Sullivan. Please welcome Simon and Sandra.
Look, I'll just acknowledge the team. These competitions are incredibly demanding. To win a competition like this, you have to go so far beyond what you can normally ask of anybody. These things require such commitment, such collaboration, such support. So we have a great team that work together with us on this competition. So what's this competition about? This is one of these great spaces in the world. It's like a painting, Hyde Park, and it's generated around the Archibald Fountain, the memorial. It is a composition, it is complete, it is beautiful. The city is a curtilage to this space. We have this site where on the one hand, we're trying to deal with the fact that the building should be a backdrop, but it's right on the axis. In fact, the axis runs through the site. So there's an inherent conflict in how do you respond to this? Do you pretend it's not happening? Do you recognise the axis? That was the fundamental challenge that we were trying to deal with. So the first thing we did was try to understand the nature of Hyde Park. What's the urban structure of Hyde Park? It's an interesting space because it's quite chaotic in a way. There's some very sort of orderly parts of the space where the buildings are of a similar height and scale and character, and then these eccentric elements, the courts, the cathedral, I don't remember the name of the building on the west, but these taller elements that really stand out. So on the one hand it's a composed space, but on the other there are these taller buildings that have this sort of conversation, more distinctive buildings that have this conversation with each other. And then you have the memorial sitting amongst it all. We looked at what the appropriate role was for this site. So you could take a bookend approach. You could say, well, this building should be conversing with the building directly to the north, and there should be some sensible relationship between the two. But that was sort of contrary to the idea of the curtilage to the space being a frame, and a frame shouldn't interact with the painting. So the buildings shouldn't be trying to mark themselves, shouldn't be trying to identify themselves, they should be trying to become part of this reasonably inert curtilage to the memorial. So we ended up thinking, well, let's just look at the south side of the park. There is some unusual consistency between each of the buildings. Yes, you can't avoid the fact that the envelopes, the axis, required this geometric relationship with the memorial, but you can compose the building and its materiality and form with the neighbouring buildings, and that was the approach that we took. And at the ground level, we tried to use the geometry of the space to generate the forms for each of the buildings. One of the challenges with the building envelopes was their unusual geometry, and we looked at the geometry of the park, the relationship with our site, and came up with a strategy, which I'll let Sandra talk about, for how we were going to achieve the GFA without an overly busy architectural form. So we ended up with this composition, and I have to say, even now looking at this, there is too much similarity in the axial composition between the buildings and the memorial. It's very, very difficult. I don't know what you can do with this, because we're trying to respect and enhance the memorial, and we have this fundamental composition which is generated by the memorial. So it's an extremely difficult architectural problem. I think our approach of taking a muted and a curtilage type relationship with the adjacent buildings was the right approach, but there is this fundamental challenge, I think, in the nature of this site and its relationship with the memorial. So just very quickly to talk about the basic strategy to our massing, we have the stage 1 DA envelope. We have the requirement in the competition, I think, for daylight to come to the central breakthrough on the axis. We ended up taking this approach where we broke the building into two. You can see on the right-hand side, on my right-hand side of the image, there is a bump coming off the western building. We thought that was undesirable. It would be better to have simple pure forms to sort of calm the composition down. We generated a form by looking at the viewpoints from the memorial, which created an angular axis which allowed us to achieve the optimal GFA and remove that bump. So that was our basic strategy. Over to you, Sandra.
Thank you, Simon. The other strategy was to acknowledge there was a requirement for a podium, and while we wanted to bring the towers to ground because we wanted to simplify the relationship between the tower and the podium, we still wanted to have something within the building that created that recognition, and that was sitting broadly at the podium where it was defined. The one thing that Simon broadly spoke of was the notion of recapturing the GFA that we had lost by being almost too excuse the English, anal about having these two frontages being equidistant and therefore achieving the perfect geometry. So we decided to fill in what was originally meant to be a celebratory space in a plaza to become a through-site link. And I'll explain a little bit further. With that, that link really created two different worlds. It was the world of the city and the world of the neighbourhood. And that was something that we really felt that was important. We didn't want the space between two towers to be a place to stay and look upon. We wanted that place to recognise the axis, celebrate the axis, but be a point of arrival and departure. That then created different types of characters for the different places that we had created within the master plan. And the final piece within the articulation of the volume really lied on the way that we treated the roof. There was a very strict height plane to protect sun access to Harmony Park, and obviously the always needed GFA, and the more GFA you obviously have at the top, the more value there is. So there was almost this intricate cut and articulation of the top of the towers to achieve that. So really simply, the way that the diagram of the tower works in its northern elevation is described here. We had on this competition 2 rounds. We had the opportunity to refine some of our ideas on the second round. One of the comments that was raised by the jury was potentially the lack of time that we had to really resolve the ground plane, and also the notion of the diagram of the tower coming to ground and what it meant in terms of weight and in terms of materiality, and how it related to the streetscape, so that you really understand the diagram of the tower. There was this real desire to have a very simple, calm facade, as Simon mentioned. We used the same modulation grid because of the proximity between the towers. We had a different strategy for the facade in the middle. But the only thing to note, especially in high-rise residential, that it's very difficult to obtain proper fresh air into the bedrooms, and what we did was effectively create Juliet balconies for every bedroom so that every room had proper fresh air. And this is really the way in which the tower is represented from the south, and the ground plane, the different characters within the street. It's very hard to understand exactly what we did in terms of the acknowledgement of the axis, but it was this notion of these 2 podiums almost touching together, but using light to come to ground to really celebrate the movement. And this was the work that did on the second round, where we felt that perhaps there was an opportunity to humanise and create a more human scale on the plinth, by creating a plinth on the tower. And just very quickly, the 2 images that described effectively how the scheme came together towards the end. Thank you.
That's wonderful, thanks so much. So the next presentation will be Crone and Andrew Bernstein. So I'd like to welcome up Ashley Dennis, who's now at Bailey Ward, and Andrew Burns.
Good evening all. So yes, this project was a strong collaboration between Andrew's team, recently rebranded as Architecture and Marla Landscapes, and Bangalore, with Crone as the incumbent Stage 1 DA architect, and then moving into the competition. As mentioned, I no longer work at Crone, but was generously asked by the team there to present the scheme because I had involvement through both stages, Stage 1 DA and competition. And I think, like for me, because that journey started early on in the Stage 1 DA, I just sort of wanted to touch on that, and I'm conscious that the Council Tall Buildings brings together people from all different types of backgrounds. I actually have been asked a number of times, how does the feasibility stack up on this project? Replacing a significant commercial office building with residential. And I guess the answer to that is our brief was always, as an offshore investor purchasing this site, the brief to us was really, we see this as an anchor site for us, and the ideal outcome is to optimise residential on the site. And so I think through that stage 1 DA process, our client really became the investor as well as the city to try and balance the needs of both and achieve, a good feasibility outcome, but also a good outcome for the city. And so in a way that was the genesis of the gesture of the two towers, and beyond the fact that adaptive reuse of the existing tower, it wouldn't comply with minimum floor plate sizes of residential, cross vent and solar become extremely problematic, and working very closely over a journey with a relatively small team of Corinne and Ethos Urban and others, we collaborated closely with the city to find an urban outcome that was of benefit for the client, but also for residents, and particularly for residents who sit south of this site where solar amenity is significantly improved. I think as an incumbent stage 1 DA architect, it can be challenging, and it's sometimes that thing of too much to then move in to the competition, and questioning every move based on a conversation that you had based on technical constraints, and also the fact that you because it's a complex site and an extremely sensitive site, you show your cards at stage 1. There's a very intentional response to materiality, to the formality of the memorial axes as a a response to Sydney's colonial heritage, and also materially to Sydney's colonial heritage. And so in thinking about how do you then evolve that thinking into the competition, to be honest, I think the fact, even though it was a forced marriage, the idea of a fresh set of eyes, being Andrew and Bangalore and Marla, is a really beneficial process, and allowed myself to step back from that. And so evolving the thinking beyond the colonial heritage into how do we weave in country, as an analogy, expanding that axis beyond the formality of the memorial axis is a really important point that Andrew can expand upon, and just tonally flipping it from, Sydney's a sandstone city to what about the tonality of the park as a recessive backdrop to the memorial. So I'll let Andrew jump in if you're comfortable at this point.
Well, I think actually probably underselling the stage 1 DA. I think that's a beautiful concept, and that idea of creating a void on access with the memorial was very powerful. I think Batesmart ultimately resolved it very well, displayed great judgment in that. It is interesting when you work together on a competition. I feel during COVID, I can remember those late night sessions. I think at 2 o'clock in the morning one night during one session I turned my camera off and had a power nap a few nights before. But being emerging practice, I feel when you're in a design competition with multiple buildings, in emerging practice it's easier. You can be responsible for one part, but when it's one building, it actually requires another level of experience of practice to be on the same level of understanding the critical drivers. And maybe we weren't quite at that point then. I feel we are now, by the by. But so I guess this is where we got to. Down diagonally from the site, just to the southwest, is Australian House, which was the Greek community who opened up their facility during the freedom protest in. I think it was 1950. 68. Okay, sorry, I should have. but it's so sort of, this is actually, in immediate proximity to this site is a very significant location for the local Aboriginal community. So we thought there was a potential of deflecting that strong access through the site using landscape to then direct that through to Australian House, which is down on the bottom left. Okay, next one. Yeah, so sort of deflecting the access, this powerful gesture of the access. We looked at, I guess, just various things in how we resolve the design, a sort of stacking strategy with a tightening kind of grain at the top of the building, maybe counter logic, and just having that very clear expression of the void in the sky. The stepping form persisted, I guess, from the. It's really interesting to see in the previous scheme the resolution to avoid that, which is quite insightful. I guess here is, stage one DA aspects that were so strong from the concept DA, but we thought maybe we could just inflect that northern end of the facade to pick up that, because actually the axis of Hyde Park is not perpendicular to Liverpool Street. It's actually, I think, a 7-degree offset or something. So that we thought was a potentially strong generative aspect in the design. Probably ultimately a fairly glazed tower, I'd say.
Yeah.
Very high glazed ratio.
Like in hindsight, let's flick through this obviously, and we can see why we didn't win the competition. but in saying that, I think we're extremely proud of the conceptual framework, and given the right execution of that conceptual framework, this could have been an amazing project. And it's that sort of leap from urban design to architecture that maybe didn't quite translate.
Simple floor plate, serrated facade on the edges to try to capture the axial views. The value of the northern view and the northeastern view in Sydney is so powerful. This is a dress circle site, which you can see resolved through the floor plate. That simple cross middle area through, and then with the break either side, so sort of a real breadth into the core of the building. I guess, it's sort of interesting to see this height plane, with this asymmetrical height plane, how that resolves against the logical ultimate formality of the building is an interesting question. I think it was certainly a challenge, because it's quite a radical sort of formal requirement, but actually the conflicting requirement is this very calm backdrop to the memorial. I guess the presence of, I don't know, what were we going to say about the podium?
It's kind of the opposite of that. It's that really recessive response, picking up the tones of the park. We know that Hyde Park, the greenery in Hyde Park has formed a recessive backdrop to the memorial forever. So why shouldn't the building? And I think, as I said, the stage one explored the idea of a warmer toned Sydney building, and this was intentionally kind of looking at the buildings next door and saying, oh, you know what, maybe that glassy backdrop with some deep green quality materiality in the podium is a better response for this location.
I think it's, as an aside, it's hard to win a design competition with a green tower. Sort of a lot of people lob them out there, but they never seem to get up. The simple materiality, I guess, responding to the original terraces that were on the site. Generous thresholds, eaves. Trying to have a sense within that central space, which I guess was the compromise in the previous scheme, the sort of balance of that, rebalancing that GFA to then compress the central space, which had a certain intensity, but maybe open view to the memorial. Sky curtilage around the memorial was valuable, and trying to have a sense here of that character of the sort of arbour of Hyde Park brought into the site was positive. Crafted podium expression. This moment where that axis deflects, which I guess back towards Australian House, which I guess also relates to the sort of asymmetry at the top of the tower.
I guess that, the key difference there was bringing the stair down directly from Liverpool Street so that the public space was kind of more belonging to the Surrey Hills threshold than the CBD. Just the thought there was, if this wants to be more vibrant, activated bars, then maybe the sensitivity of the Liverpool Street frontage is better sort of left alone, and you come down more immediately into that precinct that then has the potential to evolve to the south.
And I guess the sort of intimate tone of various small tenancies, etc. Thank you.
So the next presentation will be given by Philip Vivian and Sally Sue for the Bates Smart team. Philip and Sally are architects at Bates Smart.
Thanks, Jen. And Andrew, I don't know where you went, but I can fully empathise with your statement. It's hard to win a competition with a green tower. Sally and I will present, but I do want to acknowledge the other senior designers at Bates Smart, so Guy Lake and Josh Harricks, and interior designers Hayden Crawford and Mary Omar, as well as the rest of the Bates Smart team, and I will acknowledge consultants as we go through. So we started by recognising that we needed to reconcile the formality of Hyde Park and the Beaux-Arts axis with the sort of gritty urbanism on the other side of Surrey Hills, and how do we do that? And then we spent a lot of time thinking about how do we respond to Delit's memorial and really that formality, and how do we create a very calm civic backdrop to that building. And I guess you'll be the judges of were we successful. We started, and you've seen similar responses, by creating a pair of towers that were identical, recessing the western edge and creating two very calm civic frames behind the War Memorial, and they were picking up on the materiality of the War Memorial. The base uses the actual stone of the War Memorial before progressing into a precast that is tonally from the War Memorial. We took the proportions of the War Memorial. We spent a lot of time studying those proportions. We took those into the tower. You can see here, this is the precast, and there's a double band where it breaks into the podium. So those materials and proportions are used. We actually spent a lot of time in the competition, Sally and I and other members of the team actually sitting on this park bench and imagining what a pair of towers that framed that War Memorial would be like. And we were after something that was calm and very civic. And then from the other side of the memorial, you can see here those towers come to the ground, but the important thing we did was widen the podium base and create an urban room that acknowledged the axis of the War Memorial. And so you can see that urban room, it's 17 metres wide and it's on axis. You can see it takes the full thrust of the space of the War Memorial into that space and creates a north-facing urban room on level with the War Memorial, and as you see here before it cascades down into Surrey Hills. So it's quite a formal space. There is a glass screen between the two towers, and you have this wind-protected north-facing space on axis with the War Memorial, and you can see we brought the water element, continued it through on the other side of Liverpool Street into this room, which is a very calm space with cafes on either side. We worked with Barbara Flynn, art consultant, and Yoni Scarce, artist, and we were looking at an artwork that was hanging in that space, getting that vertical dimension, and that was forming a suite of artworks that, as you probably know, span all around the War Memorial. So we were looking to, still are looking to complement those artworks in the bigger picture. The base of the building, as I mentioned, we were replicating the exact stone that was used in the War Memorial, and we created a formal colonnade that runs along the street. You can see that colonnade, it again takes the proportions of the War Memorial and creates a generous two-storey colonnade that you can see running through here with the glass screen separating the two towers, and you can see how the podium aligns all the way down to the Mark Foy's building, and then the shift from the stone up to the precast. And then the final sort of formal move was we actually pulled together the buildings to a 6-metre laneway width at the end and created two smaller 6-storey buildings acknowledging the scale of Surrey Hills. You can see there on axis with the War Memorial, it's a nice tight space that came together, and we were looking at a sort of 6-storey warehouse masonry building, acknowledging that Surrey Hills typology. We also worked with Sasha Coles and his team at Aspect, and Janice Constable, Design with Country consultant, on a landscape work that had a yarning circle and another water element again on axis, but starting to become more informal as you move through to Surrey Hills. And these show the contrasting north and south elevations. The south elevation has the informality of Surrey Hills and these 6-storey sort of warehouse-like buildings playing off against the formality on the north side. I'm going to hand over to Sally. Hope we're running to time.
Thanks. I'll now take you through the program and planning of this project, and you'll see that all the careful consideration in design visions that was expressed externally also carries internally. The program is stacked from bottom up with car park down below, retaining the existing basement shell, with the southern end provided for the pocket park. We wanted to provide as much deep soil as possible in retaining the pocket park. Moving up, we have 2 levels, so Pitt Street and Clark Street are a storey apart, and just above and below we've built it with as much retail as possible to ensure the precinct activates. Above that we have 5 stories of commercial, and from level 6 all the way up to 35 is residential. You'll see that it tiers to respond to the Harmony Park Sun Access Plan, which we take very seriously. It's our backyard, front yard that we look out to every day, and to ensure that there is no solar impact to that. Jumping in here, we're looking at the upper ground level planned. The memorial access as introduced by Philip is seen in the middle of the plan here. We've taken the planning control from the planning proposals of 9 metres and reviewed how can we make this most successful. So we expanded it to the north to create a place, and we've narrowed it down on the southern side to respond to the Surrey Hills Laneway. With that, we've located the commercial lobbies on either side of the towers, having distinct access to Liverpool Street. With that, we also still wanted the residential towers to have distinct Liverpool address, which is the most premium. So we've located the entryway inside the urban room where number 4 is located. The urban room allows us to maximise the retail fronting it inside. We've worked with Arab to ensure the wind engineering is optimal so that we could slow down the wind that's coming through this, otherwise would have been a very strong thoroughfare. Retail is able to spill out inside and also to the north around the colonnade. And as we go down to the lower ground here, this activation across the site is carried through. We wanted to maximise the retail, both upper and lower ground, so you can see that it also fronts to Clark Street, with opportunities for large format retail in future activations. Our loading dock is tucked sensitively inside, basement entry maintaining its roughly current location, but we've made deliberate attempts to remove the secondary car park entry that would have been otherwise in the pocket park. We worked with Aspects and Janice Constable to offer a at-grade pocket park, which if anyone has been around currently, it's an elevated pocket park that seems very private. We wanted to make sure that though privately owned, it was publicly accessible. With that, connecting with country strategy of allowing a yarning circle to be a terminus, this echoes a strategy to allow for the southern access to be a journey through a sequence to the Anzac Memorial. As we move up the building, the commercial floor plate was something we were grappling with as we were designing. The previous envelope would have had a very tight building separation. As we introduced the urban room, the commercial floor plate now has opportunities to maximise daylight access from all areas, as well as appreciating that Surrey Hills has smaller enterprises that might want to enter in this location. So tenancy subdivisibility is absolutely optimum here. And as we move up, we made a deliberate attempt to carefully curate and design a typical floor plate that is carried from bottom all the way up before we had to step to allow for sun access to Harmony Lane. We had an opportunity to maximise views out to Hyde Park and Sydney Harbour, so all of our living rooms are fronting north, or if not in corner locations. Almost all of our units are dual aspects, which offers opportunities for maximum cross ventilation and solar access. And as we jump into a typical unit, one of our selling strategies that we wanted to promote was, as we provided a calm backdrop to Anzac Memorial, we also didn't want any balconies fronting it. So with that, we strategically relocated the balcony that otherwise would have been located in the corner or the north, down on the southern corner. we have an 8x5 expansing living area for dining and living. And if we double it, including the kitchen and winter garden, this offers a very expansive open plan living suitable for this address. And in summary, we can see it in this render, where this current backdrop is not only viewed from the outside but on the inside. The materiality Philip introduced is both on the outside and carried from the inside. Thank you.
Wonderful, thanks very much to both of you. Okay, so next is the presentation for this evening will be given by Rob Behrens for the Fender Katsoulides and Wongtang team. Please welcome Rob.
It's terrific to be here tonight, and I must say, as a competitor to these competitions, it's really, really exciting to see what the other teams have come up with, because you can't possibly imagine anything else but what you did. But our team was also a terrific collaboration between Barbara Flynn. She didn't tell us she was on your team as well, Oculus Landscapes, Wong Tung. She didn't tell us. Wong Tung, who are a Hong Kong-based architecture practice, which is why they're not joining us tonight, obviously, and Flux on a sustainability level. And I might just start with some of the really early key design principles of the site, and everybody's talked about the mandate from the brief to really enhance the axis of the Anzac Memorial. We noted, obviously, that there is a misalignment of the axis, however, by about 7%, and so part of the design generation for us was how to actually manage that realignment and probably soften, as you can see on the top right image, the blow of the misalignment by very soft, curvaceous inner forms of the building, which actually, in a sense, realigned the axis. We also looked at how lower levels of activity would respond orthogonally on the left-hand image to orthogonal architecture either side of the site. How in the middle sections of the tower, in the middle of the lower slide there, how wind mitigation is a very important issue. Actually, we talked a lot to the wind consultants about how to mitigate downdraft into the site and through the through-site link. So therefore, radiusing the edges of the tower proper seemed like a really important thing to do. But then actually up at the upper levels of the tower on the bottom right-hand side, to bring the building back to an orthogonal square relationship with the orthogonal buildings either side. So it really did morph its way between the bottom and the top of the site, responding to the context of buildings opposite, responding to the axis which we, in an attempt, realigned with the memorial. So the end result, we had hoped the objective was to be a soft, discreet and respectful backdrop to the memorial. We spent a lot of time hanging around in the building as well and sitting in the park and thinking what might best be there to celebrate the memorial and not overpower it. So we elected a very simple palette of materials and a more probably darker tonality, and again in contrast to the memorial, so it in fact stood out in front of the backdrop of the architecture behind it. Again, with the softness of the inner curves of the material realigning the axis, and the softness of the edges as well, contrasting with the buildings adjacent. So, of course, it all started with a master plan. We worked very closely with Oculus to start really the ideas of the axial alignment with the War Memorial, with the Anzac Memorial, I should say, starting with the building across the cascade, the Oculus itself, and again bringing in water into an Oculus on our side of Liverpool Street. And again, the fact that the axis comes all the way through the park and terminates in an odd space and then turns a corner into the park. And so how can we deal with all that? How can we bury a narrative into the ground plane? It was a really important factor for us. We'd researched some of the Indigenous history that had occurred on this site, and we'd understood there was quite a lot of gaming and, in fact, war games that occurred at a time. And so we did consult with Barbara about how to really weave art into the narrative of the ground plane and find places along that axis that would be really instant reminders to people walking through, and perhaps even a termination at the end where you see number 4 of a remembrance of the Indigenous past through the site. To the ground plane, which is king, obviously commercial was a minor part, about 5 levels of commercial at the lower end of the building. We elected to bring our commercial lobbies in from Liverpool Street. That's where all the action, the activity is, and the commercial world is, facing the park. So 2 lobbies mirroring an oculus there in white along the pedestrian link. A retail opportunity on that top left-hand corner, also could have been a bar or a cafe facing back into the CBD. And as much activity as possible along the ground plane, which did, as people who didn't know the site that well, actually descends by about 4 or 5 metres from memory back down towards Clark Street on the south. So again, those commercial lobby spaces obviously celebrating whatever picture-framed views of the memorial are possible, but becoming active spaces, be they cafes or bars, doubling into commercial lobby spaces as well. And actually at the Liverpool Street end of all that, allowing people to flow through and being invited into that pedestrian link or the plaza area, but also protected from any downdraft coming from the building by very transparent canopies above. Down at the lower ground area, this was then coming at the Clark Street level below. This is where we elected to bring in the residential lobbies with the feeling that it was a more quiet and safer zone to be in than perhaps the Liverpool Street with all the activity, the buses and the action of the CBD. So you can see 2 residential lobbies mirrored either side of the pedestrian link. Again, retail activity, F&B, activating the Nithsdale Street side, and all of the action that's associated with EOT facilities, bike parking and so on, with a little bike shop happening also in that space below an open oculus above, going up to the through-site link at ground level. So lots of activity where possible at the lower ground space as well. By pushing the stair forwards towards the memorial, we were able to actually frame a view, and I think I saw a very similar image in the Bait Smart show to try and celebrate the view from Clark Street of the memorial, and it became an amphitheatre and almost a performance space embedded with artwork and framing the memorial, which is also, again, another element shared in Philip's scheme, was to create a glazed protection from the elements, be they wind or rain, so that the through-site link actually became an all-weather space as well. That could have been a lot of fun. We looked at timber cable trusses and glass diagrids that could even be trafficable to link people across the podium spaces. And then, of course, the 5 commercial levels. There aren't many of them, so they become boutique, essentially, as commercial spaces with paired commercial lobbies either side of the pedestrian through-site link. We did this during COVID, so we buried some little meeting spaces and telephone spaces on the right, as you can see into it, but giving as much daylight and amenity through northern views across to the park as possible, because we do know that from there you can get views across to the Anzac Memorial, in fact right across the other end of the park. So some of the cues we took for the design of the podium really were born from the memorial itself. We saw a very interesting split grid facade, which we rotated 90 degrees for this podium. I think there was a requirement in the brief for quite a high percentage of solidity in the podium facade. So we used sandstone as a soft, discrete material. We buried landscape into the podium facade to draw landscape across the park and into the building itself, and used precast materials where possible against the backdrop of the memorial. You can see here how the podium again was designed to follow the datum line of the Mark IV's building also across, so the Connaught building became the only building without a podium, but important to continue that datum line, we felt. The fun stuff in the above the commercial levels was obviously a chance to have some residential amenity, be they swimming pools, a club lounge, a co-working space, a little theatrette and a gym. So all of those were right at the treetop levels with terrific views towards the north. And in fact, we cheated a little bit here. We sent a drone up, and I'm sure we could go to prison for doing it now, but we did that to just see what you could see from 30, 60 and 120 metres and where the best aspect for residential apartments became, and designed those apartments. You can see on the right-hand side of both these plans, which are the typical apartment levels, main apartment being a 3-bed one with the better view towards the northeast, and packed as much aspect of view and daylight for each of those apartments to the north as possible, even some of them on the south edges actually sneaking a view through the gaps towards the north also. How that was done through shading and winter gardens. We elected to use a winter garden technique but with an open top to it so that it became a naturally ventilated space with a bronze bullet awning there, which allowed obviously shading for hot northern high sun to allow low winter sun to penetrate into the apartments. And the great fun again right at the top of the building possibly was for another sky lounge, something for the high rollers to come to visit, and they're in some rentable space for residents and guests to have as a dining or lounge facility with terrific views over the harbour. Obviously that's obviously from one of our drone shots, and the inevitable mega penthouse at the top for the really high rollers, just one of them, a 400 square metre apartment with heroic views. This was all about the top of the building, and I think Graham, who's here tonight, somehow kept on saying the fifth elevation, everyone's got to get that right, and I've always remembered that, and so we really tried to actually treat this rooftop as an elevation of the building, and obviously it steps down through the sight lines of the building, but we really tried to imagine that as part of the language of the Anzac Memorial itself, the ziggurat form, which was replicated from the memorial to the rooftop, and in fact use clues from the centenary extension. Beautiful, beautiful piece of work with some really lovely materials which we brought back into the building, the precast concrete, the bronze detailing and the timber through the building, through the stonework at the base and in the podium, the glazing, charcoal, aluminium framing, bronze detailing and timber soffits. So in the end we tried, as I said, to create a very discreet backdrop to the Anzac Memorial, something which is soft and curvaceous, recessive, and has more of the tonality of the hide, obviously, on the right-hand side than the Connaught on the left, because we felt it was probably the best way to be respectful to the memorial itself and create a really lasting thing for the city. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rob. So then the final presentation this evening will be given by Emily Wilmore for the SJV team.
These presentations do always feel like you're about to get naked in front of a crowd, and this one is particularly so. You're about to see why. So this is the starting point, obviously, for everybody, the proposal to demolish a commercial building of this scale and this quality. And in essence, through the stage 1 envelope, resulting in a form that actually reduces floor space. And that is about achieving the gap on the axis. It is an extremely important axis for the city. We 100% agree with that. But we did question whether it should be terminated at the back end of Surrey Hills by this building in creating a gap. The axis, in essence, stops at this site. It is the termination point before it drops into a gully of Surrey Hills. And unless we plan to continue a line of demolition through Surrey Hills and south, it's never going to exist on this site. And historically, this is also the starting of a ridge line that connects to the eastern coastline of Sydney. It was a First Nations walking track that we now know as Oxford Street, and it also connected around to Parramatta Road. So it has importance for other reasons. We see design excellence competitions as an opportunity to really push city making, and there's some really key sites in the city that deserves, and we think this is one. We all have seen how important the axis is. And rather than terminating that with a gap, we think we should terminate it with a marker, and we took quite a different approach in the form to achieve that. Not dissimilar to what other European cities do. You build a monument on the axis, you terminate it with something special, you don't end it with a gap. And there's a lot of focus about this piece of sky that sat above the Anzac Memorial, which we didn't really understand. And we did a bit of work with Sophie Bock from NBRS who produced these sketches, and we looked at some alternate strategies from a heritage perspective of what you do on an axis. In essence, the axis is lost into a void if you take the approach of the stage 1 envelope. In its existing form, it is terminated at a street wall, and this view to the sky is blocked by the street wall. Another approach is introduce a marker, a singular marker, and make the sky bigger around that marker, which looks like this. And at a city scale, this is a marker that is known and understood and continues the skyline towards the south. It's not a dissimilar approach to what's going on in New York, where super tall, skinny towers with fast-moving shadows finding themselves next to a super large public park. And if we're going to go to the effort of demolishing a building of this scale to build a new building, it should absolutely be the best residential in the world. We also think that it deserves a public component to the site, so we introduced a full public ground plane and a public observation deck at the top of the tower. Another thing that we don't do in Sydney that other cities do around the world is share those views with the public audience. We also introduced a small building next to that to hold the street corner, and we saw this as a building that would be gifted back to the city. Ideally, we saw it as a shelter for people in need or crisis housing, because people in need deserve the best address in Sydney also, and we should be judged on how we treat the people most in need in our cities. In doing one building, it makes us a better neighbour. We were actually able to achieve compliant separation distances with the neighbouring residential buildings. We don't create wind tunnels, and we share the sky. So this is looking at the distances we achieved between the other buildings. The other thing we've heard is the axis is slightly off north, and it's super annoying to look at. And the only way to resolve that in a pure way is actually with a circle. So we did a lot of work in the plans. They're beautiful plans and beautiful apartments, as this place deserves. And the integral structural system meant that was quite flexible and could be interchanged based on market needs or over time. It also meant the greater distances meant we were getting solar further into the site. The circle's good for cross ventilation. And not dissimilar to some of the best buildings in Sydney by Seidler, the structure was integral to the design, and it could work for commercial and residential. We introduced a very simple and repeatable module for each level, and it was all about the veranda and a heavily protected edge for all the residential apartments. And it's simple in its form, and it's repeatable, and we think results in an elegant form. We worked with JMD, Anton from JMD did these sketches from a landscape perspective, and we saw the site as a sandstone plinth, and in setting this building back, we're actually giving some relief to Liverpool Street, which is a very harsh environment, and creating a little landscape that's extremely Sydney. We also proposed a 3-story height artwork that would start a conversation with the Anzac Memorial, and in contrast to focusing on war and invasion, this would be an artwork by a First Nations artist that talks about peace and the future. The landscape also radiated out from the centre of the tower and became a tessellation of sandstone and gardens, and we too obviously created the pocket park to the south. The gap between the buildings started the character of Surrey Hills, where tightness between buildings is what you'd expect in Surrey Hills. So this site is also about transitioning civic scale to the Surrey Hills scale. and grain. The material palette is extremely pared back and timeless, and you can see that it touches down as lightly as a 77-storey tower can. And the landscape transitions and steps around, creating pocket gardens for dwelling in for free. The commercial building is having an address to the pocket park as well as to the side street and Liverpool Street. And you can see here the tightness that creates. We slipped the car park underneath the plinth, entered from Clark Street, and resolved access for residences separated from public access that allowed people to get to the top of the tower in an orderly way. The community building was a free plan, and as I said, we had multiple different plans for this to be housing. It could be childcare, it could be a multiple different series of uses, and it could change over time. And above that, the typical residential levels kick in, where there's a roof garden to the top of the community building. At a mid-level, we had a recreation level for residents with a swimming pool. Top level is the public event space and viewing deck and plant. To back ourselves up a little bit, we did some analysis on the neighbours. We improved solar access to all of the neighbours quite significantly by doing a singular tower, and we improved the sky view factor significantly by a 0.2% increase of sky visible within 200 metres of the site. The end.
Wonderful, thanks so much. So I would like to invite all the speakers up to the front for a couple of quick questions. Please come on up. Would anybody like to jump in with the first question?
I love seeing all the schemes. I love seeing all the way you develop different criteria for being able to develop how you achieve your approach. And when I look at schemes like this now, I often think about the future of AI being able to actually do a lot of that thinking that architects do now in these schemes. And I loved the very final scheme by SJB, because it was almost like something a computer can't do, which is say, nah, bugger that. I don't like what was there, I'm going to do something completely different. But I suppose my question is, what do you see, this is to everyone I suppose, the future of architecture when the inevitability of all of that knowledge and ability of all those different criteria can be all brought in to a AI machine to produce a series of options to be chosen and curated and judged. So just a view from our panel on that.
I could start something up. Yes, we'll all be out of a job within weeks. It's the greatest fear of every generation of the technology that the one after it's going to deal with, and the fact that we'll become obsolete pretty soon. But not really, because every generation adapts to the technology which has evolved in its time, and so I'm relatively convinced that we will be able to control it and use it for its best attributes, not let it take control of us. Maybe it will, but then that'll be the way of the world. And so somehow we've got to work with it, we've got to understand it, use it for what it's worth, and use our brain power to influence the outcomes.
I think it's actually quite interesting that you, of all the schemes that were presented, I don't, I'm no AI expert, but I assume you give it parameters and it comes back and gives you solutions. The thing that humans can do that AI can't is the last scheme, which sort of broke all the rules. I think that's really interesting. So I suspect that it won't replace what we all do.
AI is a tool that we have to get used to using, and you're exactly right. If you plugged in the parameters, you would have got what we saw. And design excellence competitions are about asking different questions, and that's what we will be able to do with AI.
I mean, I think there is actually a layer to the planning framework in Sydney that is extremely advanced, and you've heard people even tonight talk about Skyview factor and the like, and those tools are extremely advanced, and they're technical tools that allow us to marry a conceptual framework with a technical framework to achieve better outcomes. So I agree, it's completely a tool, and at some point having multiple options on the table and us sort of selecting that's a path forward, move on to the next issue, and that's a path forward, it is really valuable. And I guess beyond that, there's always project management.
I think there are humane values. So if you think of how can an AI program substitute a desire to interpret and contribute to the texture, like to genuinely do that, I think that's a very human thing to try to understand that over time and then contribute and to interpret the various stakeholders and voices around. That's a sort of deep thing that I don't know, we looked at Mid-Journey and Vera, so they didn't do too much for us, I have to say.
Steve, I'm reading a book called The Future of the Professions. It looks at AI and other technologies. And every profession has different opinions, but the one consistent opinion is that technology and AI in particular will make other professions redundant, but not theirs. And I noticed you instantly said, well, are architects needed anymore? But you didn't reflect perhaps are engineers needed. You're needed, but it's a world without architects. Anyway, I think that you're reflecting similar thinking, but I do agree with everyone else. It's a tool that will enhance our capabilities, not replace them.
Yeah. Thanks for that question. I think to supplement that, referencing our own scheme, as well as having to work on the planning proposal as well, separately, I think AI is really good at processing data. So our daylight studies, our building separations, our apartment areas probably could have been optimised, but some of the emotional factors of something that we've developed through working on this site is not something that can be computed, such as why is the southern access important? Why is there a civic scale urban space important? Why is it important to not locate balconies to the north or to the west or to the east? And I think we certainly have a place to evaluate what AI can spit out for now.
Can I turn over to the audience for another question? Yeah, Ben.
Oh, you know my name. Hi, my name's Layla. Oh, it's all right. Nice to be loud. Hello, my name's Layla and I work for ACOM. Just as structural engineers, looking at new buildings where you're going to demolish an old building, there's a lot of talks about sustainability, reducing CO2. So why hasn't this design competition had a criteria where you retain part of this existing building and not completely demolish it and bring it down into the ground? We've done a new building at 77 Market Street and we've gutted an entire heritage structure and kept it and built a new tower above. So is this not something that's been considered, and if not, why?
Great question, and I didn't even prompt that.
It's the first question we asked ourselves, in fact, when we saw the competition brief. Why are we pulling down this building yield to not much higher than that? I think if this competition was run now, 4 years later, we might have a different brief on our hands, and that is how do you adaptively reuse that existing structure and save the embodied carbon that it has. At the time, the brief said tear it down and give us 2 towers, and so we didn't have the courage that SJP did to do something completely different, and we elected to go with new buildings. But I think you're right that adaptive reuse of that building existing would be a really smart thing to do.
Our first scheme was an adaptive reuse scheme, and we did those sketches as the very first thing. And that was quite quick, and I guess we wanted to submit a building. And also ask the other questions that we did in the new building.
I guess there's definitely that environmental layer to the consideration, and as there should be. In terms of the sort of heritage background of the existing building, it has been described by the Memorial Trust as a jarring backdrop to the memorial, in the way that its sort of tonality doesn't provide that recessive backdrop to the memorial. And so, you know, I'm not saying that a heritage grounding trumps a sustainable grounding, but that was definitely one consideration. And then, you know, there were definitely ideas floated and conversations around more New York loft-style apartments that don't necessarily meet technical solar compliance or cross-ventilation within an adaptive reuse outcome. At the end of the day, as I said, there's a client brief that we as architects were working to, and so we were trying to navigate meeting that brief alongside getting the best outcomes for the city, and sometimes that can be a really complex space to be in.
I might jump in there. I've had the privilege to work with Ash previously on this project as well through the stage 1 DA stage. And I think now carrying it through to DA and having it approved, there was reference to GFA on site. And I think the client's still left wondering, why has he given up so much GFA? Because if anyone knew how much is in the current building, commercial building, there's definitely a lot left on the table. But I think on the question of adaptive and reuse, or anybody that has touched this project has certainly looked at it. But I think it goes deeper than that in understanding exactly what's on site. The current building that sits there is 2 commercial buildings butting against each other with a very large core in the middle on axis, fronting Anzac Memorial. And I think you have to ask the question, if you were going to, you know, turn it into residential, what would be the best solution for it? Because we have countless schemes out there for every commercial to be reborn as a residential building, and not many has succeeded yet. And I think there's definitely reasons why we haven't been able to get there.
Can I take one or
Can I just jump in?
questions? Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
We have done a commercial building that's converted to residential, and it's worked very well. It's driven by copy economics, obviously. I think I take Rob's point very well. I think times have changed a lot, very rapidly, continue to change. I remember when my house was approved 20 years ago, condition was you shall not use any recycled materials, so continuing to change. I think this building could be adapted to residential quite easily. It would be a very different outcome. It may not have the sort of sculptural clarity and purity that most of these proposals have, but it would be a significant reuse of the building, and it's something I think that we really should be considered, and probably would be, I imagine, if we looked at it today.
Yeah, great. Any other questions from the audience? Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
So, Joseph Heine from JSBC Consulting. I'm a structural engineer. So just to add to Steve's question, the thing that I fear the most is you guys come up with all these nice schemes, and then you wouldn't have to come to us for structural advice. AI will answer all the questions for you. But my question to you guys is 2 parts. The first part is, how much advice did you guys get with each scheme that you did? With no disrespect to all the other disciplines, structure is pretty major, and you could lose a lot of space with other people. And the second part of the question is, how much of the financial feasibility of each scheme was considered while you're doing your concepts?
I'll try and answer that. I think what might not be perceived is that design excellence competition, as mentioned, is very sophisticated now. Every competition that we now go for, we have access to consultants that at this rate currently is all the incumbent that has worked with the stage 1 DA architect. We certainly have. We consulted Arup on this. So therefore we take it very seriously, because I think maybe compared to other states, our competitions and DAs are very thoroughly coordinated. They're definitely real buildings by the time we submit them.
I think we might have used Instruct. Someone else did too, wasn't it? Ourselves around these guys, but yeah, we always do that. We're a little bit frightened to do it all by ourselves, and so we get a little bit of freebie advice from our structural guys where possible. And the feasibility, I don't think we looked at too carefully, but we did spend a lot of time talking to agents about the best product and the best sizing of the apartments, which wasn't actually in the brief, strangely enough. There were no apartment sizes, which was very rare in a brief. So it's up to you to determine what they were. So determining apartment sizes are important, determining structure is important. We must have run the numbers to see how much the building would cost, but I don't believe there was a number in the brief that it had to be, was there? There was? Oh, there you go. I feel it's a very interesting question, and I think my sense is core structural thinking has sort of maybe stepped down the primary thinking in these kind of projects, and I think being in that position, you're trying to resolve, multiple conflicting geometric servicing challenges, whatever it might be, that it's sort of, you rely upon some rule of thumb criteria, but it is interesting to think the value, and if you think back to the side of the stuff, and maybe looking at Emily's scheme, the value that can come from where structure is a primary driver, core to the architectural concept. I think, that has to have great value into the future. Leaner, more sustainable, resourceful buildings.
Not on the structural front, but I think it's extremely relevant to this project, is like sometimes those things are elevated to extreme importance, and so the wind issue on this site did emerge more after the stage 1 DA, where a condition of consent was to sort of run that wind tunnel testing, and so you sort of had this ambition for a certain urban design outcome that was somewhat conflicting with the measures required to mitigate wind, and so I'm sure there's instances where structure is equally that important factor that makes things stack up. But look, there is always an ongoing conversation in the design competition world of why don't we just dumb it down to an idea sort of charrette process, and we take all of that out of the equation and assume that it can get resolved. I think it's just architects, like, we shoot ourselves in the foot and we try and do more and more and more and more. So it's the holistic scheme that does try and bring together all of those factors in a short period of time still does seem like the best way to do it.
I didn't think we thought ours was necessarily feasible, but we didn't think that the stage 1 was either. So, and it's yet to be proven if it is.
Well, just to add some of the comments, I think high-rise buildings are particularly different from typical small multi-residential buildings. I think in a high-rise tower, you have to think about the efficiencies of scale, you have to think about deflection, you have to think about how do you manage the integration of the architecture and the structures as one. Many of us here have done not a single tower, so the more you do, the more experience you get, and while having a consultant team right next to you kind of giving you advice, you also learn with experience what are the rules of thumbs and what are the things that you have to do to kind of at least tick the basic principles. That said, the structure of a building takes 70%, if I'm not wrong, of all the embodied carbon in the building. So you want to make sure that you do it as tightly, as efficient as possible, because that's the thing in the building that will last the longest. So services will go, facade will probably be replaced, but the structure will be there. And maybe it's also about us the same way we're talking about buildings being retrofitted from commercial to residential is actually us thinking about what are the right floor-to-floors that we're building today, and how can we in 10 or 20 or 30 years' time still be using the buildings the same way we're using buildings that were built 100 years ago. I think that's the thinking, that we should be designing with a little bit of tolerance so that we can give the next generation enough opportunity to retrofit our buildings the same way we're doing to the generations before.
Probably at the core of your question is almost, you're seeing architects up here, but I think the design is always highly collaborative with a large group of consultants, and I think I heard every single person who presented acknowledge the consultants. And in a perfect world, if we had a lot more time to present, each of those consultants, I think, would present what they've done. And I look at certainly our reports, and I'm sure others have sections on structure, services that show the work of others, but it's not just showing it, it's, I would say we cannot design buildings alone. It's a collaborative exercise.
So then, on that note, before we wrap up, I'd like to just go down the panel and invite you all to say one last comment. What would you do again, or what would you not do again? Maybe if we start at the front here with Sandra.
No. I think in many competitions, you give the best you have within the time you have to reflect upon a project, and there are not many competitions where I've lost, where I felt that there are very little things that I would change. I think I will stick to my guns and feel like, there are small things that we could have done better, but the essence of what we did is really, in my belief, the right response.
Actually, we probably have quite a few things. I think a clear consistency or modulation of expression between podium and tower would, it's a pretty niche issue, but yeah, that was sort of missing.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's probably higher level than that. I'm surprised Andrew didn't say his thing was not work with me again. Just don't overthink things. I think it's been sort of a really cathartic process opening up this presentation again that we sort of haven't looked at since we presented the scheme, and so I think that over analysis and sometimes it's freeing yourself up to put something on the table that you truly believe is a better outcome rather than trying to tick every box.
I like SJB's scheme the best. But seriously, I think in retrospect, we probably spent a lot too much time listening to our wind consultant. And we're probably punished for it because we curved so much of the north-facing sections of the tower to mitigate downdraft. And I believe the jury might have questioned it in terms of its ability to resolve either the cost of curved glass or the faceting that you have to do over a very tight radius. And so maybe we suffered from not being able to resolve what we felt was the right thing to do. And I noticed that actually the other three schemes didn't curve or radius besides. So maybe you didn't have wind advice like we did.
I feel we get to the end of a competition scheme and I think you said it actually, Rob, you can't imagine doing it any other way. And I sometimes get this panic reaction that maybe everyone else has done the same and we're no different. What I love about nights like tonight is you see the amazing amount of different creative thinking, and you see ideas and you go, wow, why didn't I think of that? And I just think it really opens your eyes to the incredible range of possibilities. So I love coming to nights like this.
But to follow on, I hope I'm okay to say this publicly, we did think about possibly combining the two towers very earlier on in our design ideation phase, but I think the majority ruled. I think our team looked at each other and go, no, that's probably not a good idea. But as we come this far now, I think what I have learnt, I'm not sure what I would do again and not do again, but what I have learnt is I think sometimes it's so hard to search for clarity in the design vision. And I think when we look back, some of these ideas are very simple, but like what our team members are saying here along with the panel, not to overthink it. And I think we stuck to what we thought was going to be a clear offer to Liverpool Street and Sydney, and kept everything else very simple and neat, functions and needs. Yeah.
Taller and skinnier. No, we all looked at ourselves very hard as well to say, do we want to design this building or do we want to design this building? And we decided we wanted to have fun with it. And I don't think we regret doing that.
Well, given that the four of the schemes are very similar and that we were in this second round, I suppose the obvious answer for us is that we would have put a city room into our scheme with a glazed roof. If it didn't change the outcome, if we knew that we were going to not win the scheme, I think we would have probably looked at something along the lines of SJP's approach. I think my sort of concern at the relationship between this strong axial composition and the building that represents the glory of Australia passing through something that represents the sort of commercial skullduggery of the city, I find very uncomfortable. So I love the idea of it being terminated by something of great moment. So I think that was a great solution.
Yeah, terrific. I'd like to invite everyone to thank our panel again. And of course, a very big thank you to our major sponsors, Oxford Properties and Schindler, and to our event sponsor tonight, Arab. Please give a round of applause to Arab. And of course, the CTBUH Sydney Committee for working in the background to get us all the delicious food and drink and wine that hopefully we can enjoy around the corner. So thanks everyone.